shared decades with, the father of my children, was taking his last breaths just steps away, and I was kept from holding his hand. It felt like life itself had stabbed me in the back, a double betrayal, from the daughter I'd raised with so much love, and from fate, which now even stole my right to say goodbye. I pressed my palm to the closed door, as if my touch could pass through wood and reach him. But deep down I knew they had decided to erase me from the last chapter of his life. Anger swelled inside me. How dare they? After everything I had done, after every sleepless night caring for him, after every meal I skipped so their plates would be full. The nurses avoided my eyes. Strangers felt the weight of the scene. I wasn't invisible in that moment. Ty was the woman cast to the side, the wife humiliated in the cruelest way, and inside me, a single word rose up: vengeance. Not the loud kind, no shouting or scandals, the quiet kind that waits, that watches, that bides its time. I looked into my daughter's eyes. She looked away. That glance away was the biggest confession of guilt. She knew exactly what she was doing. She stood with someone, maybe her husband, maybe her own pride, but not with me. There, in that cold hospital corridor, I made a promise. I would not let this injustice go unanswered. I walked away slowly, the sound of my footsteps echoing on the floor. Each step struck like thunder inside me. The humiliation still burned, but beneath it something else was rising. Strength, I whispered to myself, like an oath. It was there, in front of the closed door, that I understood. They were determined to erase me from the last chapter of his life. But they forgot one thing: I was still alive. And I wanted to know, what were they hiding behind that door? I went down the hospital stairs slowly, as if each step were a blow. My eyes were still wet, but I refused to let a tear fall in front of them. If they wanted to see me defeated, they would have to wait a long time. That night, the silence in the house felt larger than ever. The empty bed, his pillows still indented where his head had been, the smell of medicine that lingered in the air. Everything shouted the absence I hadn't yet learned to face. But louder than the pain of the loss was the echo of betrayal. How could my daughter, the one I had given everything to, whom I'd sheltered from every hard wind, look at me and tell me I didn't need to say goodbye? I remembered when she was little, the nights I would skip meals so she could have milk in her cup, the clothes I altered, sewing hymns by lamplight because we couldn't afford new ones, the times people called me a strong woman because I endured everything without complaint. The truth was, I wasn't strong. I simply had no choice. And now, all those years of sacrifice seemed erased by a single act of humiliation. I, who had been the foundation so many times, was now treated like a burden. While trying to sleep, a memory pricked at me. A few days earlier, I'd seen my daughter whispering with her husband, as if they were hiding something from me. At the time, I dismissed it as a mother's paranoia, but now, it made sense. They had been preparing my exclusion. Anger boiled in my veins. This wasn't only pain, it was indignation. And indignation, I knew, could be turned into strength. I needed to understand what was behind all of this. It wasn't just about being denied a goodbye. It was about something bigger. A scheme meant to leave me out on purpose. I sat down, closed my eyes, and breathed deeply. I know many women understand this kind of silence. That heavy silence, not peace, but exclusion. Like when conversations stop when you enter the room. When decisions are made and you only find out later. I'd lived that so many times, but in that hospital, they'd crossed the line. And if they wanted to erase me, I would make sure to leave my mark where they least expected it. I shut my eyes again and made a quiet promise. It was not just for Met, it was for all the women who'd been sidelined, who'd heard the cruel phrase, "You don't need to be here." I needed to find out. I needed to pull the truth out, even if I had to do it with my own hands. What were they hiding behind that door? I went back to the hospital the next day. Not to fight, not to plead, but to observe. I'd learned early that silence sometimes reveals more than 1,000 questions. The nurses looked at me with a mix of pity and embarrassment. Some turned away, others offered a quick, almost whispered, greeting, as if afraid of being seen talking to me. That's when I realized my exclusion hadn't been an accident. It was being planned. I sat on a bench in the corridor, a few yards from the room door. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the gestures. My daughter slipping in and out in a hurry, her husband close behind, whispering in her ear. When I drew near, voices dropped, conversations stopped, eyes weighed upon me. It was as if I'd become a stranger in the life I'd helped build. The pain tore at me. But with each hidden gesture, each hushed word, my outrage grew. They weren't just keeping me from the goodbye. They were hiding something. That night, at home, I sat on the couch and stared at the family portrait on the mantel. My husband smiled in the photo, surrounded by our children. I remembered the times he had told me, "You are the anchor. Without you, nothing would stand." And now, my own daughter wanted to pull the anchor away, as if I'd never existed. What could be so grave that they thought silencing me would be easier than facing me? I breathed deeply. It was there, in front of the closed door, that I understood. They were determined to erase me from the last chapter of his life, but I understood something else too. The more they tried to exclude me, the more I would pursue the truth. I rose, a quiet fire burning in my chest. They didn't know, but with every step they took to push me away, they gave me more reason to fight. And in that moment I asked myself, what exactly were they so afraid I would find out? On the third day, it was no longer just pain. It was a bitter mix of rage and suspicion. I walked the hospital corridors like a shadow, trying to piece together fragments of conversations, exchanged glances, the papers that disappeared too quickly from doctors' hands. I realized it wasn't just my daughter and son-in-law. Others seemed unwittingly complicit. Nurses who'd once treated me with respect now avoided contact. The doctor dodged my questions with vague answers, as if there was a silent order, "Don't let her get close." And that's when I understood my exclusion wasn't merely emotional. It was strategic. The room where my husband lay dying was a closed door, not only to love but to the truth. Something was being hidden behind that door, and I was the only one barred from knowing. That night I lay awake. I turned my mind inside out for any clue. Why would they do this to me? I who never let anything be missing. I who gave up my dreams to support theirs. I who had been mother and father, wife and worker, all at once. And still, in that crucial moment, I was treated like nobody. Injustice, betrayal, humiliation. Those words whirled inside me like knives. I closed my eyes and made a silent promise. If they denied me the last goodbye, I would drag the truth out from the shadows that they tried so hard to hide. But fate hadn't turned the final page yet, and I knew, sooner or later, that secret would come to light. The only question was, what were they hiding? That night, lying in my empty bed, I couldn't fall asleep. Images returned like an old film, each scene heavy with memories that no one but me truly knew. The hospital, the closed door, my daughter's cold face, all mingled with echoes of the past, as if time forced me to revisit every sacrifice that got me to this point. With every memory, the sense of humiliation grew. It wasn't only being shut out of a final goodbye. It was the weight of realizing that my whole life of giving seemed to mean nothing. I closed my eyes and went back in time. I remember the first sleepless nights at my husband's side when his health began to fail. I'd sit on the edge of the bed, holding his hand while the fever climbed and his body trembled. I applied cool compresses, rose hour after hour to check his breathing. The doctor said treatment would be long, and patience would be the greatest cure. I didn't have patience, I had love. Love enough to give up rest, to ignore taking care of myself, to forego the small pleasures other women my age still enjoyed. While friends traveled, met for coffee, and had light conversations, I lived inside pharmacies, clinics, and hospital corridors. It was my life. It was my duty. It was my silent pact with him. How many times did I wake exhausted, yet still make coffee for the kids before school? How many times did I eat stale bread so there'd be milk left for them? How many nights did I mend the clothes they tore playing, sewing till dawn because we couldn't afford new ones? These scenes might seem small to an outsider, but for me they were the essence of life. They were where I put my love into action. They were where I proved that, even without luxury, there was dignity in our home. The worst part is, I don't regret any of it. If I had to do it all again, I would. But what hurts, what eats away at me, is realizing that for my daughter, all of it was lost. She looks at me and doesn't see the woman who gave up herself so they could have a better life. She only sees an inconvenient presence, a shadow that gets in the way of her plans. And that realization is the cruelest wound of all. How many times have I cared for my grandchildren even when my body begged for rest? I picked them up from school, watched them so she could work or have time for herself. I never complained. I never said, I can't. My life revolved around being support, the invisible foundation of the family. And now, that very foundation was treated like debris. I remember one afternoon in particular. My husband was in crisis, and I couldn't get his fever down. My daughter came home complaining about her hectic life, her demanding boss, not having time for herself. I wanted to shout, "What about my time? What about my pain? Who cares for me?" But I stayed silent, because I'd learned to swallow words, believing that's what a loving mother should do, and that's how I spent my life, swallowing tears, keeping grudges, stifling desires, always thinking, one day they'll understand, one day they'll appreciate it, but that day never came. Now, in the hospital, I realized maybe it never would. Indignation knotted in my chest. It was as if my entire life had been reduced to nothing. Years of giving, of love, of sacrifice, wiped away by a single phrase spoken by my own daughter. "You don't need to go in, Mom. It'll be better this way." Humiliation. That word haunted me like a ghost. Worse was thinking that, in her mind, perhaps everything I'd done never mattered. Still, that night, looking up at the ceiling, one memory offered a small comfort. I remembered how my husband always thanked me in his way. He wasn't a man of many words, but his eyes said everything. In moments of clarity, he would squeeze my hand and whisper, "Without you, I wouldn't be here." Those words still echoed inside me. They were proof that, at least to him, I had never been invisible, but the wound stayed open. Because now it wasn't his gaze that measured my worth. It was my daughter's cold judgment, and that judgment reduced me to nothing. I lay there replaying every detail, the sleepless nights, the grandchildren on my lap, the hot plates I served even when I had no appetite, the dreams put away for a future that wasn't for me. All of it suddenly felt weightless, and I couldn't help thinking, with sharp pain, and to think it all now counts for nothing. When I closed my eyes that night, more memories rushed back without asking permission. Memories so heavy I sometimes wondered how I could still breathe. I saw my younger self carrying grocery bags that were far too heavy for my thin arms. I'd ride a packed bus home, balancing the bags, afraid someone would crush the milk or the bread that so often ran out. I smiled at the kids even when my soul just wanted to cry. How many times did I skip buying a new blouse because the money barely covered their school notebooks? How many times did I pretend I was on a diet just to hide that there wasn't enough food for everyone? That's how I lived, putting each of them ahead of me, as if I were only the floor beneath their feet. And now, the floor was kicked aside, as if it had no value at all. I also remembered the days when my husband no longer had the strength to work. I got up before sunrise, got the kids ready, rushed to my job, came back to care for him, and still cooked dinner. While the neighbors whispered, "She won't last too much for one woman," but I lasted. Not because I was strong, but because there simply was no other choice. When he needed expensive meds, I took extra cleaning jobs. When the bills piled up, I took in laundry. No one asked if I was tired. No one cared if my hands bled from so much scrubbing. And the cruelest part was realizing that to my daughter, all that past seemed erased, as if it had been written in pencil and easily smudged by her memory. There's a scene I'll never forget. I had a high fever, nearly fainting with pain, but I still got up to make lunch. My daughter walked through the kitchen complaining she didn't have a clean blouse for school. She looked at me and said, impatiently, "Mom, you don't do anything right." It cut me like a knife. I, who did everything, who didn't stop for a second, who dragged myself around with a fever, was still seen as useless. I swallowed my tears, like always. I pretended it didn't hurt, but that sentence lodged somewhere in my soul, waiting for the day it would bleed again, and it bled at the hospital. Years later, when that same daughter denied me the right to say goodbye to my husband, it was as if everything had repeated itself. The contempt, the indifference, the lack of recognition. Another flash. The nights I watched my grandkids. They were little, bursting with energy, and I didn't have the same strength anymore. Still, I chased after them, invented games, baked simple cakes to brighten the afternoon. How many times did I postpone my own doctor's appointments to stay with them because my daughter said, "Mom, only you can help me." And I helped always. I never said no. I never set boundaries. I thought I was building ties of gratitude. But I learned I was only digging the hole of my invisibility deeper. Memories tumbled over one another, the smell of coffee before dawn, the times I sewed costumes for school plays, the pride in their eyes when they brought home good grades, as if they'd achieved it all alone, never noticing the nights I stayed up studying with them, going over sums and rehearsing essays. I was present in every one of their victories. But now, at the cruelest defeat of my life, I was left alone. Indignation squeezed my chest like a trapped scream. It was as if I were being forced to accept that my entire life had been wasted. But I wouldn't accept that. I couldn't. I know many women like me have felt the weight of being treated as nothing after a lifetime of giving. And that's the pain that hurts the most, realizing that sacrifice wasn't enough to earn respect. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the memories flood me. I remembered how my husband, even sick, looked at me with tenderness. He didn't need many words. A simple squeeze of his hand held more recognition than all of my daughter's speeches. Maybe that's why she wanted me out, because deep down, she knew I'd been an inseparable part of his life, and her presence would never erase mine. The tears finally came, not from weakness, but from revolt, from realizing that even the love I gave had been used against me, turned into a burden, a reason to silence me. And then the thought came, almost unbearable, and to think it all now counts for nothing. After the night I was swallowed by memories, I began to see clearly what I'd refused to admit before. The signs of exclusion had been there for a long time. I just refused to see them. Now, with a wounded heart, every detail screamed in front of me. It was like a curtain had fallen, revealing a stage that had always been set, and I, blind with devotion, hadn't noticed. I started to recall the conversations that stopped the moment I walked into a room. Sometimes my daughter was in the kitchen speaking softly on the phone, and all it took was me opening the door for her tone to shift. She'd hang up too quickly, pretend to be looking up recipes, invent excuses. At the time, I told myself it was in my head, that she just wanted privacy. But after what happened at the hospital, each of those silences carried a different weight. It wasn't privacy. It was secrecy. The invitations started disappearing too. Birthdays with my son-in-law's family, dinners with friends. I only found out when I saw photos posted afterward, and when I asked, I got the same answer. "Oh, Mom, I thought you wouldn't like it. It's young people, not really your thing." A polite way of saying, "You don't belong anymore." And I accepted it, trying to believe it was for my own good, a kind of protection. But the truth is, it ate away at me. Even family gatherings began to change. I used to be the center of the table. The food I cooked brought everyone together. Now they often arrived already fed. They made a point of bringing takeout, as if what I cooked didn't matter anymore. It's hard to explain that pain to someone who hasn't lived it. It may sound trivial: a rejected pot of beans, a cake no one touches, a table that no longer fills up. But for someone who dedicated her life to the home, those small gestures are invisible knives. They deny the value of who you are. And then, there were the whispers. A quick glance between my daughter and her husband. A half smile when they thought I wasn't looking. I pretended not to notice, but each gesture piled up like stones on my back. One scene branded my heart forever. One afternoon, I was in the living room folding laundry. The door was ajar, and I heard my daughter on the phone. Her voice was low, but the sentence cut through like a blade. "We need to settle this soon." But without Mom finding out, my body went cold. Settle what? And why couldn't I know? I froze with the shirt in my hands, too afraid to move. My heart pounded, and for a moment I thought she'd see me there. But no. She just ended the call in a hurry, and walked in with a forced smile, as if nothing had happened. In that moment, doubt turned into certainty. They were hiding something from me. And what hurt wasn't just the words, it was how naturally she said them, as if excluding her own mother were normal, expected. Indignation took hold of me. Everything made sense. The invitations that never came, the conversations that died when I appeared, the shared looks, all of it pointed in the same direction. I was being pushed aside on purpose. What were they planning? What decision could be so serious that it had to be resolved without Mom knowing? That question began to throb in my mind day and night. And I knew that sooner or later the answer would come. After that phone call, nothing sounded innocent to my ears. Every gesture, every half-spoken word, every crooked smile seemed to carry a hidden truth. I started paying closer attention, and the more I noticed, the more it hurt. The next Sunday, my daughter said she wouldn't come over for lunch. "We've got plans, Mom. We'll come by another day." She didn't say what plans. On Monday, I saw photos on social media. A barbecue at my son-in-law's family's house. Everyone smiling, toasting, as if life were a party. Except me. It was just a photo, but it felt like a slap. I, who had cooked Sunday lunches for everyone so many times, was now treated like leftovers. Indignation. That word burned in me every time I remembered. Another time, I heard my name whispered. I was in the yard watering plants when I noticed voices in the living room. "She'll get in the way," my son-in-law said. "I know," my daughter replied. Silence. When I walked in, they changed the subject as if nothing had happened. I wanted to ask, get in the way of what? But my throat closed. Maybe because I already knew the answer. I was getting in the way of their lives simply by existing. Even with the grandkids, the signs appeared. They always ran to me when they arrived, but slowly they began to keep their distance. One day I heard my daughter say, "Don't tell Grandma, okay? It's our secret." I saw the little one nod, innocent, not even understanding, and I stood there in the hallway, swallowing the feeling of being excluded even from small confidences. These things might seem small to outsiders, but to me they were invisible blades, cutting slow. The hospital only exposed what had been happening all along. I wasn't barred all at once. I'd been barred for years from their lives, their choices, their important moments. The difference was that now I could see it. Now I was clear. That night I remembered the sentence I'd heard on the phone. "We need to settle this soon." But without Mom finding out, those words wouldn't leave my head. Settle what? A secret about my husband, about me, about the house, the inheritance, anything that mattered. Their silence was crueler than any answer. And I knew that sooner or later the truth would come out. But the doubt consumed me like slow-burning coals. It was there, among the cut-off conversations, the averted looks, and the closed doors, that I understood. I was no longer welcome in the very life I helped build. And the question echoed, relentless. What exactly were they settling without me knowing? In the small hours, still unable to sleep, I let my memories drag me far away. It was as if the past had returned to collect on a debt, to remind me of everything I gave without thinking twice. The first image was my daughter's birth. I remember the day clearly. I was too young, full of fears and uncertainties, but when I held her in my arms for the first time, everything else disappeared. Her cry was fragile, but to me it sounded like a hymn. Right then I made a silent promise. I would give everything so she could have a better life than mine. And I kept that promise. Every day, every night, every drop of sweat went to her. In those early years, money was so tight that every coin already had a destination. I even saved on bread, buying it at the end of the day when it was cheaper. I remember walking miles on foot just to catch a sale at the market, while other mothers bought disposable diapers. I washed cloth ones, scrubbing until my hands were raw, because that's what we could afford. But I did it smiling, because every sacrifice turned into pride when I saw my daughter growing healthy and bright. Later, when school began, there were notebooks, backpacks, uniforms. I knew I couldn't let her feel different from the other kids. How many times did I work double to buy new supplies, even if it meant wearing my old, faded clothes? One year there wasn't money for a backpack. I spent nights sewing a used one I'd found, reinforcing the straps, embroidering flowers on the front so she'd feel special. On the first day, she walked into school, showing it off as if it were the prettiest in the world. I stood outside, crying silently from joy and exhaustion. My greatest pride was watching her study. I always told her, "What I didn't have, you will. What I didn't learn, you'll learn." How many times did I skip meet to save for a prep course? How many times did I make excuses to coworkers so I could save every cent for her future? I didn't live for myself. I lived for her. What hurts most, looking back, is how it all seems erased now. Every renunciation, every battle, every sleepless night, none of it carries weight in the present. My daughter doesn't see the mother who carried her in her arms, who fought hunger and pain. She only sees someone who, in her words, didn't need to be there anymore. The same daughter who received everything from me was the one who blocked me from saying a last goodbye to the man who stood by my side for a lifetime. It was an old wound that never healed. I remember how, as a teenager, she often answered me with ingratitude. A rolled eye, a "you don't understand anything" thrown in my face. I told myself it was just a phase, but maybe it was already a sign of a contempt I refused to see. There were arguments, shouting, tears cried quietly in my room. She accused me of being strict, of not understanding her wants. I only wanted to protect her. I remember when she wanted to go out with friends in the middle of the night. I said no, she yelled, "You're ruining my life." It was like a stab, but I took a breath and accepted it. I thought, one day she understand. I comforted myself with the idea that everything I did was out of love, even when that love felt like a cage to her. I also remember when, as an adult, she came to complain about life, about her boss, her job, her marriage. I was always there to listen. I made coffee, baked a cake, pulled out a kitchen chair, and let her pour it all out. I was the ear, the comfort, the lap. And now, when it was my turn to need someone, I was pushed aside, as if my suffering didn't matter, as if I had no right to hurt. The most painful thing was sensing that, maybe, on some level, she always blamed me. Maybe she blamed me for giving so much that she never felt the weight of the struggle. Maybe she saw me as someone who was useful only while she needed me, and now that she thinks she doesn't, she discards me without remorse. That night I closed my eyes and let the weight of it all fall on me. I felt the pain in my hands again, the tired knees, the loneliness of sleepless nights, and I realized how foolish I'd been to believe love alone would be enough to be remembered. The entire past stood before me like a mirror. On one side, the mother who gave everything. On the other, the daughter who now treated me like nobody. That contradiction pulsed inside me like a cruel sentence. It was as if life shouted at me, "The love you planted has grown into thorns, and each thorn now pierces your skin, reminding you that not every sacrifice is recognized." I closed my eyes and drew a deep breath, feeling the bitterness turn into a suffocating emptiness. The past crashed into the present as if mocking me. And in the whirl of those memories, I thought, I never imagined she'd be the first to turn her back on me. My heart was already heavy with suspicion, but nothing could have prepared me for the cruel confirmation that arrived so unexpectedly. It happened during a quick visit to a cousin's house. I was in the kitchen pouring coffee when her phone buzzed on the table. Without meaning to, my eyes caught the glow of the screen. And there, raw like an open wound, was the message. "She doesn't need to say goodbye. It'll be better this way." The message was from my daughter. Her name was right there as the sender. For a second, I thought my heart would stop. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hands go cold. It was as if each letter of that sentence had been branded into my skin. She doesn't need to say goodbye. Me. They were talking about me. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't exaggeration. It wasn't a wounded mother's paranoia. It was a decision, a plan, a deliberate exclusion. I leaned on the table to keep from falling. My cousin saw my face go pale and asked if I was okay. I forced a smile and said it was just a dizzy spell. But inside, a hurricane had already torn through me. I whispered the sentence under my breath, as if I needed to hear it to believe it. "She doesn't need to say goodbye." What kind of cruelty is that? Who has the right to decide who can or can't say farewell to the man I spent my whole life with? What kind of heart can type that so coldly? I dragged myself home, each step an unbearable weight. I lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. The sentence kept echoing off the walls of my room, as if mocking me. "She doesn't need to say goodbye. It'll be better this way." Better for whom? Not for me. Not for him, my husband. So, better for whom? That was when rage finally took root in me. No longer quiet indignation or resigned pain. It was a fire in my chest demanding an answer. I trembled not with fear, but with fury. I paced all night. The scenes at the hospital mixed with the words from the message. My daughter blocking the door. Her cold look. The nurse's complicit silence. Now it all made sense. They had decided. They had agreed. I was not part of the goodbye. I was not part of the end. I closed my eyes and remembered every moment I'd stood by my husband. The nights I held his hand through bouts of pain. The fear each time he choked. The relief when he slept peacefully again. I was there. I lived every moment. And now they said I didn't need to be there for the last one. It was more than unfair. It was a cruel betrayal. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A new message. It was from my daughter-in-law. "Let your daughter handle everything now. She knows what she's doing." The words hammered at my mind without mercy. It was as if her voice became a permanent echo, taunting me, reminding me of my insignificance in the very life I helped build. I remembered when she joined our family. I welcomed her with open arms, like a daughter. I made sure to include her at dinners, to remember her at Christmas, to cook her favorite dish. I even defended her choice when relatives criticized the marriage. And now, she stabbed me with the coldness of a sentence typed in seconds. No pity, no wait, no second thought. "Let your daughter handle everything now. She knows what she's doing." It wasn't just exclusion. It was cruelty. It was an attempt to erase me. What hurt even more was the complicity of my daughter. It wasn't the daughter-in-law who blocked me at the hospital. It was her. My own daughter put those words into action, even if she never said them aloud. The message was just the concrete proof of what I already felt. A cold, digital scrap of paper sealing a blood betrayal. I sat in the armchair and cried, but they weren't weak tears. They were tears of anger. Anger at myself for staying blind for so long. Anger at them for thinking they could reduce me to nothing. Anger at fate for pushing me to the limit. I stood and walked to the kitchen. I grabbed a glass of water, but my hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. With every tremor, my heart throbbed as if it would explode from the inside out. Never in my life had I felt such a sense of betrayal. I looked again at the family portrait on the shelf. All of us smiling, side by side, as if we were perfect. In that photo, no one would guess that one day, I'd be treated like an intruder. I traced my fingers over the glass, slowly, realizing how much it was only a frozen illusion. I had held that family up with my hands, with my renunciations, with my silence, and now, at the most important moment, they threw me away like dead weight. I knew the last goodbye wasn't just a moment, it was a right. It was the dignity of closing a circle of love, and they ripped it from me. I spent the whole night repeating the same question. If I wasn't needed, then who was? That doubt gave me no peace. It was as if something larger lurked behind the exclusion, something still hidden, a secret, a motive they didn't dare reveal. And deep down, I was certain that message was only the beginning of a truth even more cruel. After reading that cruel message, I could have stormed into my daughter's face and thrown the truth at her. I could have shouted, cried, demanded explanations, but not this time. I knew any impulsive word would be turned against me. They expected me to explode, lose my composure, to confirm the bitter old woman image they'd been crafting behind my back. I wasn't going to give them that gift. I chose silence. But it wasn't a submissive silence. It was the silence of someone who plans, someone who knows the best response isn't a shout, but the right moment. I began to watch every gesture, every look, every unfinished sentence. I learned to move through the house quietly, almost soundless, so I could surprise conversations. I noticed how my daughter and her husband exchanged quick messages, how they whispered in the corners of the hall, and always, when I drew near, silence fell like a stone. It wasn't paranoia, it was reality. They were plotting something. And now, more than ever, I needed to know what it was. At first, the silence hurt. I wanted to scream, demand answers, confront them, but I swallowed every word. And over time, I felt the power in my silence. They relaxed. They believed I'd given up. They thought I had surrendered. Little did they know that behind that calm look, my mind was a storm. I was connecting dots, gathering fragments, assembling a puzzle. In those weeks, I started recalling every odd detail. The doctor who averted his eyes when I asked, the nurse who treated me awkwardly, the hurry with which my daughter hid papers when I entered the room. Everything, absolutely everything pointed to a secret. And if they were so afraid I'd find out, that secret could only be serious. Sometimes, when we were all in the living room, I pretended to be distracted, flipping through an old magazine. But in truth, my ears were alert. I heard stray phrases, fragments that meant little on their own, but, together, left a trail. Settle this soon. She doesn't need to know. It will be easier that way. Easy for whom? Hard for whom? My silence made me both spectator and hunter. They thought they were erasing me. In reality, they were buying me time to prepare. And it was in that silence I found my weapon. Every observed gesture, every unspoken word was ammunition saved for the right moment. I wasn't the defeated woman they imagined. I was the woman who waited. Silence became my refuge and my strategy. While they believed they had silenced me, I was listening more than ever. It was in the pauses, the averted looks, the interrupted sentences, that the truth began to emerge. I started noticing small things. A paper my daughter slipped into her bag. A quick whisper when I walked into the room. Even the grandchildren, innocent, let truth slip out. One of them said to me, "Mom said you're too tired to handle things." I smiled at the child and stayed silent, but inside my heart was on fire. Tired, yes, I was tired, but not too tired to fight, not too tired to let them steal my dignity. Each day my silence grew with my strength. It felt like I was weaving an invisible net, thread by thread, waiting for the moment to pull it tight and reveal whatever hid in it. At night, lying in bed, I rehearsed everything I still needed to discover and repeated to myself, not now, wait, watch, keep. I knew exploding would be easy. Resisting in silence was the true battle, and I was winning. The strange thing was, they bought the performance. My daughter spoke to me in a patronizing tone, as if I were too frail to understand. Mom, rest. You don't need to worry about anything. Nothing. After a lifetime of worrying about everything, suddenly I didn't need to. It was the cruelest form of exclusion. Infantilization. They treated me like a burden, a decorative presence with no voice or choice. But I was listening and planning. I began to take notes. I found an old notebook and every night wrote down stray phrases, gestures, details. I didn't trust memory alone. I wanted proof. I wanted that when the time came, nothing could be denied. In that quiet writing, I found solace. Each line turned pain into strength. On paper, I was rebuilding what they tried to tear down, my truth. Suspense consumed me, and yet it fed me. I was no longer only the wounded woman. I was the vigilant woman, lying in wait, ready for the turn. Sometimes I even felt a small pleasure watching them believe in my passivity. They thought they had erased me. Little did they know that in the silence I was more alive than ever. It was in silence that I was reborn. Each swallowed word became courage. Each held back tear turned to resistance. I was not invisible. I was patient. That night I wrote the line that would become my oath. They don't know it yet, but I'm already ready to act. Silence had taught me to wait, and, as happens when someone truly waits, fate eventually handed me a key. That key was hidden inside my own house. One day, while tidying the bedside drawer, I found a yellowed envelope. My heart sped as soon as I recognized the firm handwriting on the front, our daughter's name. It was from him, from my husband. For a moment my knees went weak. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the envelope like a sacred relic. My fingers trembled. My heart thudded in my throat. He had left something for her, something I had kept hand. No one else knew it existed. I opened it slowly, afraid to tear the fragile paper. His voice seemed to rise from the lines. I recognized the care in his phrasing, the clarity with which he always addressed our daughter. He wrote of love, pride and responsibility. It was as though he'd anticipated what might happen after he was gone. Every line mixed warmth with warning. There was a sentence that stopped my breath. Respect your mother. She has always been the pillar of this home, even when no one saw. Without her, nothing would have held. Tears fell before I could stop them. He hadn't left my daughter just words. He'd left me confirmation that I wasn't crazy, I wasn't invisible, I wasn't disposable. He knew it, and he'd written it down. I closed the envelope carefully and pressed it to my chest. It was as if he was still there, telling me, hold steady, the time will come. In that instant, I realized I held my first silent weapon, the concrete proof that I hadn't been alone. For days, I kept the letter hidden. No one suspected. My daughter continued her performance of exclusion, treating me like useless weight. But I watched her with new eyes. I held a secret she didn't know. That secret was my shield. At night, I read the letter again and again. Each sentence bolstered me. My husband had trusted me enough to place those final words under my care. He hadn't given them to anyone else. He'd entrusted me to pass them on to our daughter. Mini-climax. In that moment, I understood. The letter wasn't only for her. It was also for me, a reminder that I still had worth and that my voice couldn't be silenced so easily. I folded the envelope back up, hid it in the drawer, and locked it with the key I kept in my pocket. No one suspected, no one guessed, but I knew the letter had power. Used at the right moment, it could change everything. In the days that followed, I moved through the house as if nothing had changed. Outwardly, I was the same quiet woman, bearing the stares and interrupted conversations. But inside, something had shifted. I had the letter, and with it, power. My daughter had no idea. When she spoke to me in that condescending tone, convinced I was too dim to understand, I smiled and thought, if only you knew what this paper says, you'd lower your eyes right away. It was almost ironic. She treated me as invisible, yet I carried the piece of paper that could make her indifference unbearable. The letter wasn't an immediate revenge. It was the seed of a turning point. I had to wait for the moment when every word would land like thunder. Sometimes, alone in my room, I read the lines that mixed with my tears. Respect your mother. She was the foundation of everything. Without her, nothing would have stood. I felt his voice in me, steady, as it had been so many times in life. It was as if he reminded me that I still had a voice and a place. I practiced each day my looks, my silences, my combi, 'cause I knew the day of revelation would come. And on that day there would be no denying who I was. One night I woke with a clear thought, as if a whisper came from beyond. Do not reveal it too soon. Wait for the right hour. I rose, touched the envelope, and closed the drawer again. My heart beat not with fear, but with determination. I was no longer only the wounded woman. I was the guardian of a truth. In that instant I understood. I didn't need to raise my voice or beg for respect. I already had proof of who I'd been. The letter was silence turned into a weapon. I spent the next days with a different calm, outwardly older, frailer, and more tired. Inwardly I carried a secret that strengthened me. They believed they had won. They thought they'd erased me. But little did they know. I knew. The time to present the letter would come. In the small hours, the phone rang. The sound cut the house's silence like a blade. My heart knew before I even answered. The doctor's voice came choked. I'm sorry, he's gone. For a moment, I was speechless. It felt like the ground had vanished beneath my feet. I clutched the receiver tightly, but the words wouldn't fully register. He's gone. I, who had spent nights by his side, who had tended every fever and held his hand so many times, was not there in his last breath. Not because I didn't want to be, but because they denied me. Pain mixed with a suffocating outrage. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I let the phone drop and the house's silence swallowed me. The funeral arrived too quickly. My body felt light, like I was walking through a bad dream I couldn't wake from. I dressed slowly in the simplest black I owned, not for display, but out of the respect I had always carried. As I adjusted the veil on my shoulders and looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. There were marks on her face, not only from age, but from years of silence. Still, my eyes were steady. I would not let anyone steal my right to say goodbye, even if they tried. I arrived early at the chapel. That's when the public humiliation began. My daughter was already orchestrating everything beside her husband. She gave orders, greeted guests, smiled the hostess smile. When she saw me enter, she froze for a moment, then performing for others came over and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek without meeting my eyes. Mother, please sit over there, she said, pointing to a chair in the corner, far from the coffin. A corner, far away. As if I were just another guest, not the wife, not the woman who shared his life. People noticed and whispered, but why is she so far back? Isn't that the widow? I felt each murmur like a cut. My daughter, however, acted as if everything were in order, receiving flowers, telling stories, taking center stage in a way that hurt more than any insult. I sat there invisible at my husband's wake. It was in the neighbors' eyes and in the whispers of acquaintances that I understood. The exclusion was no longer just my private, silent pain. It had become a public spectacle and everyone knew it. I obeyed my daughter's curt gesture and sat in the corner. From there, I could see the coffin surrounded by flowers, but the distance felt like an abyss. It was as if they'd drawn an invisible line between me and the man with whom I'd shared my whole life. Guests arrived one by one and soon noticed the scene. Some approached me, embarrassed. My condolences, they murmured, avoiding looking too long toward where my daughter ruled the room. Others weren't so subtle. But why are you sitting back here? An old neighbor demanded. Come, sit by the coffin. Before I could respond, my daughter glided up, smiling for everyone, but with cold eyes for me. She'll come later. We need to organize the line now. The neighbor looked taken aback. She said nothing, but in her eyes I read indignation. I wasn't alone in my pain. People saw. They perceived it. Comments spread through the hall. This isn't right. The wife over there, like a stranger. I've never seen anything like it. My daughter pretended she didn't hear, or maybe she was so convinced of her power she believed nothing would disturb her image. But I felt the mood shift. The wake ceased to be only a farewell. It became a quiet judgment, not against me, but against her. I stayed silent, but my mind was boiling. Each whisper was a spark, each diverted look fuel. I knew the more she tried to push me away, the more visible the injustice became. At one point, an older woman from the community approached the coffin, and before leaving, looked at me in the corner and said firmly, "Stay strong, my dear. He always said you were the foundation." Those words struck like lightning across the room. People exchanged glances. My daughter tried to smile, but the flush on her face revealed her. I didn't have to speak. Others were speaking for me. Still, the pain of exclusion was unbearable. I wanted to be near him, to touch his hand, even if cold, for a moment. But each attempt was blocked. It was as if my daughter had decided that even the final goodbye would be denied me. That's when I realized the scene wasn't only about me. It was about power, about who would appear as protagonist in front of everyone. And in that cruel theater she wanted the starring role. I was only an extra. It was in the neighbor's eyes and in acquaintances' discomfort that I saw. The humiliation was no longer a secret confined to four walls. It was on display, and every witness became a record of my pain. Anger burned, but I remained composed. I didn't give the scandal they expected. I didn't stand up to argue. Silence was my weapon, and each quiet minute made me stronger. They thought they'd reduced me to nothing. I knew that, sooner or later, that same silence would undo them. I left the chapel that night weighed down but with my head held high. Behind me I still heard whispers and questions. Inside, one phrase repeated itself like a promise. They think they've won. The wake ended, but that day's image wouldn't leave my mind. Every compassionate glance, every whisper of outrage, every cold move from my daughter, burned like a branding iron. I came home dragging my body, but inside a new flame ignited. It wasn't just grief or pain anymore. It was indignation. I sat in the living room chair, still in my funeral dress, and let the silence settle. I looked around the house I had built with him, the companion I'd lost. The walls kept echoes of our life together, laughter, arguments, sleepless nights, interrupted plans. Now everything seemed cast in the shadow of a cruel betrayal. It wasn't just mourning that crushed me. It was exclusion, the humiliation of being set aside as if I had no right to exist. I closed my eyes and pictured his face one more time. It felt as if he said to me, "Don't give up. You are stronger than you know." And with that, the pain began to change. It stopped being weight and became fuel. For days I remained quiet, watching my daughter thought she'd won, convinced her public performance had buried me along with him. But she didn't realize that while she kept me on the margins, I collected every last scrap of strength I had. Grief didn't break me. It awakened me. Tears that had once come from sorrow now came soaked in rage, not a blind rage, but a steady anger from someone who knew she'd been wronged and understood her own worth. Looking in the mirror, I no longer saw just a tired woman. I saw a survivor, a mother who had endured, and I realized no one had the right to erase my story. I opened the notebook where I'd been recording what I'd seen. Pages of notes, half sentences, suspicious looks, interrupted conversations now, read like a ledger of resistance. On the last blank page I wrote in firm letters, "I will not be silent." It was the first time I stated that to myself without fear. As I wrote, each letter felt like a brick in rebuilding my dignity. I remembered the letter I'd found, his letter to our daughter. There lay proof that my worth was not made up. He had recognized everything I'd done. If she rejected me now, she was rejecting his memory too. That gave me clarity. I had to act not for petty revenge, but for justice. I wanted the truth to come out. I wanted everyone to know who I truly was, the pillar, the woman who held everything together. I wanted her to face, publicly, the shame of denying what could not be hidden. Sometimes in the night I found myself smiling not from joy, but from certainty. Time was on my side. She thought she'd buried my voice with him. But in reality, that was the moment my voice began to be reborn. It was in the silence of the empty house that I felt the pain was no longer merely pain. It was a flame, slowly burning, lighting my path to justice. I was no longer the victim. I was the woman preparing. Looking at the open notebook, the hidden letter, and the memory of the man who always called me his strength, I made the promise that would guide me. I will not be the one to be embarrassed at the end of this story. The wake was over, but the seventh-day Mass approached. Once again, it could be another moment they used to sideline me and reduce me to an extra in the life I had lived. I knew this was also the right moment. For nights, I'd thought about how I would use the letter. I didn't want outbursts or shouting. I wanted something simple, discreet, impossible to erase. At the Mass, in front of everyone, I found my answer. I arrived early and sat on a pew near the aisle where everyone could see me. My daughter was once again center stage, arranging flowers, issuing directives, accepting hugs as if she were the sole heir to grief. She seemed confident, too confident. I waited silently. The envelope in my bag felt like a stone. Every step here, Every sleepless night, every held-back tear had led to this moment. The Mass began. Prayers rose like old chants, and my heart pounded not from fear, but with the certainty that something was about to shift. When the priest approached for final words, I stood and walked to him. With steady steps, I handed him the envelope and murmured, "He wrote this for her. But today, everyone needs to hear it." The priest looked surprised, then nodded. He put the envelope with the book and went to the pulpit. The room fell silent. People murmured. My daughter turned and looked at me with suspicion. I didn't avert my eyes. I sat back down with the serenity of someone who already knew what would happen. The priest opened the envelope, smoothed the yellowed paper, and began to read. His voice rang clear through the church. "My daughter." It felt like time stopped. Everyone held their breath. They realized at once, these were not the priest's words but the voice of a man who was no longer among us, my husband's voice. My daughter froze, eyes wide, unsure what to do. I watched color climb in her face. With each line, the act she'd been performing crumbled. "Respect your mother. She has always been the pillar of this home, even when no one saw. She supported our days, bore our pains, sacrificed dreams so we could have what we have. Never ignore her, never belittle her, for without her, nothing would have endured." And then the sentence that chilled my daughter and my daughter-in-law, who sat in the front row. "I want her by my side until the very last moment. It is my wish. It is my right. No one has the power to deny her that place." A murmur ran through the congregation. Some covered their mouths in surprise. Others exchanged looks of indignation. The truth was there, plain and incontestable. He himself had written that I should not be kept away. And yet that's exactly what they'd done. My eyes filled, but the tears weren't of sorrow. They were tears of justice finally spoken. The church was utterly still. Even the creak of the pews sounded loud. No one dared interrupt. His words were a verdict, a testament of love and truth. My daughter bowed her head. There was no disguise left. Before neighbors, family, friends, and strangers, she had been confronted by her own father's voice. I closed my eyes and felt a strange peace. I didn't have to say anything. He spoke for me. It was as if he had returned to defend me. And in that moment, with the church silent and his name echoing in his words, I understood. This wasn't only my fight. It was the truth asserting itself before everyone. When the priest finished reading, he folded the paper and put it back into the envelope. Silence lingered for a few seconds as people absorbed the weight of the words. Some looked at me with renewed respect. Others looked at her with reproach. I breathed in slowly, keeping my calm. There was no hatred in my heart at that moment, only the certainty that justice was beginning. My daughter said nothing. She left the church quickly, avoiding eye contact. For the first time in a long while, I walked out with my head held high. I hadn't yelled or accused anyone, but the truth had been spoken. Nothing could erase it. I did not rise to make a speech. I remained silent, because this silence was now backed by his voice, and that voice carried authority no one could challenge. "How could they?" murmured someone from the back pew. "Her own father asked it." "This is inhumane," said another. A strange peace filled me, not pleasure at their humiliation, but relief. The burden I'd carried for weeks began to lift. I was no longer invisible. I was his wife, acknowledged and respected, not because I demanded it but because the truth had spoken for itself. After the Mass, people approached me. Some held my hand wordlessly. Others uttered quiet affirmations. "You were always the family's foundation. Now everyone knows. Your husband was right." Each word soothed my heart. It didn't erase the pain, but it restored my dignity. After the Mass, I thought the silence would return. I was wrong. What followed was a buzz, the neighbors, relatives, friends all talking about the same thing. The letter landed like a bomb in the community's heart. My husband's words spread like fire across dry grass. In the days that followed, there was no corner where the subject didn't surface. In the bakery, I overheard two women whisper, "Did you see? The father himself wrote that." And still she barred the mother. Shameful. Who would do that to their own mother? At the market, someone squeezed my hand and said, "Lo, ma'am, everyone knows now. You're not alone." It felt like the streets returned my dignity to me. For the first time in ages, my pain wasn't hidden in four walls. It became visible and shared, and now it was my daughter who bore the weight of judgment. My daughter no longer strode proudly through town. She kept her eyes down, avoiding greetings. Her husband hurried by her side like someone fleeing looks. The domino effect was underway. Each person learning of the letter judged her silently, and that silence hurt her more than any spoken word. Irony was clear. The humiliation she'd planned for me turned back on her. A family lunch she once hosted with pride saw absences and cold, distant faces. The climate was heavy, and I once invisible saw how she became the one ignored. It was in the community's gaze, in relatives' gestures, in neighborhood whispers that I realized shame was no longer mine, it was hers. Each passing day made the burden heavier, but I knew there was still something they didn't know, and it would be bigger. And there was still something else they didn't know. The surprise came one quiet afternoon, when I went through his desk drawers with a reverent touch. I still kept his things carefully, like relics. At the bottom, beneath a pile of old papers, I found a folder. Inside, along with the letter already revealed, were documents signed, recorded, stamped. My eyes skimmed the lines and my heart raced. He had made it clear I was the legal custodian of the estate, the house, the savings, even the small investments. Everything was in my name by his express will. My hands trembled. For a moment I thought about how this would change everything. My daughter believed she had control, that she could erase me and decide for me. But here was concrete proof she didn't rule. I did. He had trusted me to the end. I waited for the right moment to reveal it. At the next family gathering, while the tension from the mass still hung, I placed the documents on the table. No one expected it. She looked at me suspiciously. "What's that?" she asked. I pushed the folder toward her and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "These are his final wishes. Not just words, but who he chose to care for what he left behind." Silence fell. She opened the folder with trembling hands, and as she read, color drained from her face. Her mask came off. In that instant, before everyone, I realized the plan to erase me didn't just crumble, it rebounded on its creator. She tried to protest, but her voice failed. Relatives exchanged looks, some shaking their heads in reproach. Her mother-in-law sighed in defeat. I didn't cry. For once I simply raised my head and thought quietly to myself. In that moment I understood that he had trusted me to the end. The folder with the documents lay on the table like an indisputable sentence. But I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate, because that wasn't what this was about. It was never about revenge. It was about respect, about the truth of an entire life that couldn't be erased by cruel gestures. My daughter, defeated in front of everyone, lowered her head. My daughter-in-law looked away in silence. And me, I simply took a long breath and felt the weight I'd been carrying finally begin to dissolve. That night I went home alone. But for the first time in a long while, the solitude didn't hurt. It was quiet, almost serene, because I knew I wasn't invisible anymore. Not anymore. When I walked in, I lit a candle before his photo. I looked into the eyes captured there and smiled through tears. "You trusted me to the end." And I honored that. It was a deep silence, but not an empty one. A silence full of presence, his, my own, and everything we had built together. In the days that followed, I felt the world around me shift. Neighbors came by the gate just to ask if I needed anything. One woman brought fresh bread, saying she remembered when I used to lend her sugar when she had none. A younger neighbor offered to fix the fence in the yard. Simple words, small gestures, but they embraced me in a way my own daughter no longer did. It was no longer about the estate, nor about humiliation. It was about a community returning my worth. The next Sunday, I went to Mass alone. I sat in the same pew as always, but there was no weight on my shoulders. On the contrary, when I entered, heads turned, eyes were respectful, greetings discreet. Some came to hug me, to say they were praying for me. In that moment, I felt God speak to me in silence. He hadn't abandoned me. He had given me strength to endure, to wait, to act at the right time. And I understood my story wasn't about defeat. It was about faith. Faith in God. Faith in justice. Faith in myself. That night I sat in the yard with a cup of coffee and watched the stars. The breeze was soft, as if it stroked my face. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I didn't feel hatred. I didn't feel resentment. I felt only peace. It was as if I could finally make peace with myself, with the mother I was, with the wife who stood by him always, with the woman who endured humiliation but did not break. It was in the neighbor's kindness, in the quiet respect of the community, and in the faith that never left me that I realized I didn't need to defeat anyone. I only needed to remain standing. And that was the greatest victory. I took the notebook where I had written down every detail of these days of pain and wrote the final line. the one that would define me forever. They can try to silence me, but no one can erase the truth of a lifetime of love. I closed the notebook, breathed in, and felt a new phase begin, not to forget, but to live certain that my voice would never be muted again. And now, looking at you who are listening to me, I'll leave a question that isn't only mine, but ours. And you, what would you do if you were kept from saying goodbye to the person you loved most? Tell me in the comments, like this video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any story like this one.